excited to have Haviv here with me. Haviv, welcome to the Free Press live stream.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
For those who do not know Haviv yet, Haviv Ret-Tagor is the host of the Ask Haviv Anything podcast, a veteran Israeli journalist and a senior analyst at the Times of Israel. We have a great conversation for you guys planned today about the state of the war in Gaza, the U.S.'s complex relationship with Qatar, the remaining hostages, Trump's Middle East tour, and much, much more. So let's dive into it, and we're going to feature some of our very smart subscriber questions. You're out. You ready?
All set. Let's go.
Okay, well, I want to start with the news. This week in Alexander, the last living American hostage was released from captivity after 19 months, and interestingly, the deal was brokered without Israel. What does it mean for them to have basically been circumvented from this deal?
I think it's a sign. We learned many things from this. First of all, we learned that really the Trump administration, I think, likes Netanyahu's, the Netanyahu government, and I think generally feels an affinity to it, but doesn't seem to think it's competent enough to get the job done. Trump said today, I don't know if Netanyahu can get the hostages out. And so they're not waiting around for the Israeli government to inform them of, its strategy in Gaza or how it's going to negotiate or anything like that. And they're just moving forward. That's a bad thing for Israel, but it's hard to blame the Trump administration. The Israeli government doesn't seem to be in the conversation of its own choice because of political limitations of Netanyahu, because they just simply haven't done the work. We also learned something about Qatar. Idan Alexander, when he got out, he told his family, and his family told the press, that as soon as Trump was elected, his treatment in the tunnels, in the dungeons in Gaza, became much better. And so there is a connection between the people masterminding these negotiations, these talks, the relationship with the United States. What Qatar was hoping to, Qatar, the main funder and backer and patron of Hamas, was hoping to get out of the United States, and the treatment of the only American citizen living in those tunnels. And so Qatar is really, to the Israelis, a nefarious actor here. Because if Qatar can pressure Hamas to let out one for no actual hard reciprocity of any kind for Hamas, but it drove a divide between the Israelis and the Americans that's very valuable for Qatar, and by extension very valuable for Hamas. Qatar has that power. And so Qatar has been a bad actor in the negotiations.
We're going to get to Qatar more, of course. One listener asked if Bibi feels sidelined by all of this.
There is a political cartoon in a right-wing Israeli newspaper called Makol Rishon, showing Trump and MBS and Al-Julani, the president of Syria, roasting marshmallows around a bonfire, and all on the side, on his own tiny little sort of fire of his own, is Bibi, sort of mournfully alone. That is the debate in the Israeli right now. Absolutely. They're sidelined. And they're not just sidelined on the hostages is unbelievably important. It's unbelievably central to the Israeli people to get them out. But there are strategic existential questions like the Iran deal, where the Americans, Witkoff is taking some kind of offer to the Iranians, really at these very days, and the Israelis have apparently no coordination, no say, and no real knowledge of what's in the deal. We don't know if they're going to take apart the actual infrastructure and actually prevent a nuke, or just do another JCPOA that won't. So they're absolutely sidelined. I don't know anyone who has argued anything else, and it's on things that are existential for Israel.
Let's talk about Witkoff for a second. So around 20 hostages are believed to be alive in Gaza, along with 40 dead bodies, including several Americans. Steve Witkoff reportedly told the hostage families that the U.S. wants to bring them home, but that Israel is not ready to end the war. What do you make of this rather public criticism from a top U.S. envoy to Israel?
Look, there are no good answers here. There are two camps in Israel, and one of them represents the majority of Israelis, which says they don't trust the government to really have a good end game for the war. In other words, to know how to win the war. What is Bibi's plan to win the war? This is a criticism that's heard a lot in Hebrew. It doesn't really make it to the English language press, but Netanyahu has almost not spoken to the Israeli people in 19 months. He'll go months at a time without a single interview, even to right-wing press that likes him. And there isn't a sense among Israelis, among most Israelis, I don't know the numbers, but depending on how you ask the question, 60, 70% of real majority, that Netanyahu has no sense of how to actually finish the job. Now, I don't know if he does or not, but the point is that sense in the public means that the public doesn't think continuing the war with all the sacrifices that many, many Israelis have, and of course, the much, much greater suffering of Palestinian civilians. What is it for? Is Hamas going to be destroyed? Isn't it going to be destroyed? That sense that there isn't an end game is driving a lot of Israelis to say, just sign the deal and finish the job. I have to just say, I'm sorry, it's really important to say, that doesn't mean Netanyahu is wrong, because there is now an American deal. It's been reported, it's been leaked, nobody knows the details. But what it appears to be that the Americans are putting together a deal with the Emiratis and the Saudis for a day after in Gaza that Israel can very much live with. Hamas disarmed, Hamas removed from Gaza, the leadership of Hamas removed from Gaza, and Gaza under an Arab stewardship begins the rebuilding. In conjunction with Israel, together with Israel, there is an end game that the Trump administration is trying to push that has all of Israel's fundamental war goals that it announced a year ago or a year and 9 months ago, all cooked into the thing. So if that moves forward, continuing the war until all the pressure is brought to bear and Qatar no longer stands and resists and Hamas can no longer say no to that kind of end to the war, is an Israeli victory. And so it's possible that's what Netanyahu is waiting for, and Trump is trying to deliver.
I want to ask you about the kind of broader criticism of Bibi, which goes something like this. He's more interested in continuing military operations in Gaza to sustain his coalition over freeing the remaining hostages, which is pretty dark. Is there truth to that? Is that what you're getting at?
There is a real strategic choice to be made, and you can't get away from it. If we end the war with Hamas in power, something very profound is at stake here. And the best way for me to, just the way I think about it is, the way most Israelis, I think about it. There used to be this idea under Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt in the 50s, who united the Arab states and said, the Arabs lost the 48 war to the Israelis because they were disunited and they were incompetently led, but now we're all going to unite and we're going to destroy the Jews. And that's how he talked about it. And they went to these pan-Arab wars together, multiple Arab countries, showing that a unified Arab awakening can destroy Israel, and that's a sign of its success. And we defeated those armies in war, and that destroyed pan-Arabism as an idea. And then there were other ideas that came forward. Algeria kicked out the French with terrorism, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization adopted terrorism as a grand strategy, and we defeated that grand strategy over 30 years. And now there's this Islamist sort of this particular strain of political Islam that now says we will bring this new we will return to the pious Islam of our forefathers. This is the basic idea of Hamas. We will return an Islamic politics to the Middle East, and this very radical conservative, that's a weird pairing of words, but it works in this particular case. This radical conservatism will defeat the Jews and prove that Islam is the answer to all that ails the modern Arab world. And that's what Hamas represents, and that's why Hamas is willing to destroy Gaza as part of its war strategy. In other words, to bring a war into Gaza that is massively destructive is Hamas's intent with October 7. Because all of Islam's redemption is at stake. We have to defeat that Islamist idea. And so Hamas has to be defeated. So when Netanyahu says, and he said this publicly 2 weeks ago for the very first time, for 19 months he has essentially lied. He said, he wouldn't say that defeating Hamas is strategically and historically important to the point where hostages are actually the second major, but nevertheless secondary goal. He said that for the first time 2 weeks ago, and I credit him for saying it out loud, and it's a serious point. Now, last sentence, I apologize for going on so long, but something like 40 to 50% of Israelis believe, in the best polling we have on this question, it isn't that Netanyahu has this Sophie's choice of defeating Hamas as a strategic necessity and bringing home the hostages as a moral necessity, but you can't always have them both, so you have to choose, and that's the pain of leadership. It's not that he's choosing between two necessary things and you can't have both. It's that he's actually continuing the war without having any idea how to win the war, how to defeat Hamas, only because if he stops the war, his far-right coalition partners leave and he falls. It's just for politics that he's leaving Israelis in those dungeons. I don't think that's what's going on in his head. I think you can't lead a country in war if half the country thinks you're not fighting the war honestly. but literally letting people die, soldiers die on the battlefield, hostages rot in dungeons, just for your own politics. So the problem is very real. There is a real question. The distrust of Netanyahu is a huge Achilles heel for Israelis throughout this war.
I want to get to the boots on the ground war and also the ideological war. But before I do, the last question I have about the hostages, which is really the hardest to answer, I imagine, is what will Hamas trade the last hostages for, if anything?
This is the great question. The reports on this Trump and American Arab, sort of American Saudi Emirati idea of how to end the war, in which Hamas's leadership leaves and Hamas is disarmed in Gaza. And someone else, a very upgraded, reformed Palestinian Authority, maybe a Saudi-led pan-Arab force, someone else comes into Gaza, polices Gaza, rebuilds Gaza. That idea has already received its answer from Hamas. Osama Hamdan said publicly in Doha, in Qatar, this won't happen. This will never happen. October 7 was our great triumph, and there will be more October 7. So nobody knows how to get Hamas out. Hamas can never give up the last hostage, the last living hostage. Excuse me. Hamas can never do that because then what leverage does it have? And so Hamas has boxed itself in. But that doesn't. That's a huge Israeli problem and a conundrum nobody quite knows how to get out of. And Netanyahu's the leader, so it's his responsibility. But it's not like other people just have this easy answer. But I have to say that there is, in an important sense, a huge Israeli victory here. And that huge, and it doesn't look like victory, it doesn't feel like victory, and Palestinian civilians are suffering, and the Israelis don't have the image of victory that they had with Hezbollah or overflying Iranian airspace without Iran being able to shoot down our planes back in October. There are all these tremendous victories that are obvious victories. In Gaza, there's nothing obvious, but there's a profound victory for the Israelis, which is that Hamas thought that dragging Israel into this Gaza war would destroy Israel, would bring about a massive Middle Eastern coalition, would bring the world, crashing down on Israel's head. And what ended up happening is that Gaza got trapped in Hamas's strategy. There's no rebuilding Gaza with Hamas in place. Not even because the Israelis will prevent it. You literally can't send money in. There's no bank account that would absorb the money. Nobody knows how to send concrete in. Back in 2014 to 2018, in a 4-year period, more than 5 million cubic meters of concrete went into Gaza. And that's 16 Burj Khalifas, the tallest building in the world in Dubai. And didn't build a single skyscraper. All it built was tunnels. So you can't send concrete or money into Gaza as long as Hamas is in power. And that trapping of Gaza in Hamas's inability to let go, and Hamas's inability to rebuild, and Hamas's inability to ever stop the forever war is an Israeli victory. And now maybe, hopefully, the Arab world, the Americans can come in and rescue Gaza from that Hamas trap. And the Israelis would I think, cooperate because it has the Israeli victory condition built into it.
Let's zoom out and talk about really the state of the war. Can you give us a status update on what's happening on the ground? From my perspective, I want to know how much control does Hamas have? It seems like this kind of whack-a-mole, frankly, where the IDF is clearing territory, but they're not holding it. So what's going on?
Yeah, so until now, the IDF has had a strategy in Gaza that was heavily move in and move out. Don't occupy. Don't create a massive military footprint that holds territory. Because holding territory creates, first of all, responsibilities, legal responsibilities. For example, to feed everyone and to take care of our civilians, and also it creates massive vulnerability for the forces to the guerrilla fighting of Hamas. So don't hold territory. And so it's basically a raiding war. And it hasn't worked. Now, it has worked in the sense that 80%, 70%, there's optimistic and pessimistic analyses of this, of Hamas's fighting forces are destroyed, they're dead. And huge amounts of material. Hamas used to have these public processions where they would shoot in the air. Nobody shoots in the air anymore in Gaza because you can't afford to lose the bullets because you can't replace the bullets. Those are a massive weakening of Hamas. But the kind of degradation war you need against an entrenched guerrilla force just takes longer than 19 months. The American-led Iraqi Kurdish alliance that just crowbarred with horrific damage and horrific civilian death toll ISIS out of northern Iraq. It was a 5-year war, and it was absolutely whack-a-mole in urban settings. So now Israel, because I think it feels that the timeline is expedited, the Trump administration wants an end. The Arab allies want to come in and Israel's Arab allies want to come in and begin the rebuilding. Nobody has the stomach for 2 years of degradation war in which Palestinians are living in tents. Now they've launched what is basically a occupation war where they take territory, hold that territory, and absolutely, tear apart the tunnels just much more massively. So there's going to be an escalation because the Israelis feel that the clock is ticking and there's going to be an end. So it's an escalation that doesn't sound good, but it might be good news.
As the war continues, we're on day 588. I think many people, myself included, are wondering if destroying Gaza is not enough to convince Hamas they have something to lose. And if it's not a deterrent for Iran and its other proxies, how does Israel respond to that?
Yeah, this is a huge question that Israelis have asked. One of the great lessons of October 7 for Israelis wasn't that Hamas would murder children if they ever got the chance. That we already knew. They have carried out hundreds of suicide bombings against our children. What we discovered on October 7 was that they would build the largest tunnel network in the history of warfare under cities. No civilian has been allowed into those tunnels in 19 months. The purpose of those tunnels is that when the enemy comes, it has to go through the cities to get to Hamas. And then they launched October 7. In other words, their strategy, and this is something that serious scholars have said and written, scholars critical of Israel have said and written, their fundamental strategy. There was a great piece in Newsweek about a year ago by the head of the Institute of War at the Pisa School at Columbia that literally just laid this out. Their basic strategy was the destruction of Gaza. How do you deter an enemy that sees their own polity's destruction as a cost to you, not to them? And that's basically the question of the Houthis, who cannot be bombed into submission or into stopping to launch rockets because they don't care that their own people die. That is to them a cost on you, not on them. And the simple answer is you destroy them. You destroy Hamas. You cannot destroy anything in Gaza except Hamas. That's the only thing that actually will work. And that's the basically Israeli impetus here, Israeli impulse.
Are you of the belief that Hamas can in fact be defeated?
Yes. I think it can be defeated militarily, but I also think it needs to be defeated ideologically, obviously. And everyone who says, first of all, people who say you can't defeat an idea are absolutely mistaken. Ideas are constantly defeated. They constantly die out all the time.
Yes.
Specifically in the case of Hamas, you have to learn Hamas and learn its idea. And then you find that actually it can be defeated. There are other Palestinian Islamic narratives from the conservative Palestinian Islamic world that look at Hamas and say that's not legitimate, that's not Islam, that's not the right strategy, that's not. So absolutely it can be defeated, both in the realm of ideas and in militarily. The question is costs. And October 7 made the Israelis willing to pay those costs. So I think it can be. I, by the way, have a lot of criticism of our government for badly managing the war and making it much more difficult to, but I do think it's possible.
So that kind of brings us to what the day after the war would look like. The last ceasefire deal broke down in March. It was meant to be 3 stages. It broke down in the first. In the breakdown, Israel reopened military operations in Gaza and they stopped the humanitarian aid flow. Just yesterday, they agreed to resume flow. What do you make of this decision?
This is very complex, and here's why it's complex. There is now hunger in Gaza. And that falls under Israel's responsibility. A huge amount of the panic and discourse in the West and in the media and in very prestigious media and among very prestigious NGOs about starvation in Gaza for 19 months has been a fiction, has been a lie. We have reports from the UN that said that Gaza wasn't getting nearly, not a third of the food it needed to get, but that's because the UN was only delivering a third of the food. And other NGOs were delivering the rest of the food, and they literally just left these facts out. And this is major, serious reports from the top NGOs. There's been such a whirlwind of simply dishonest propaganda. Here's the problem. That doesn't mean Gaza can't fall into starvation. And that doesn't mean that just because so much of the discourse around Gaza has been so overtaken by certain narrow ideological elites, into this insane propaganda discourse that has lost Israeli trust in the UN, claiming there's starvation, that there can't now be starvation. The IDF has decided, as part of the new strategy of taking territory and breaking Hamas as intensely as possible because the clock is ticking, has decided that one of the major elements in breaking Hamas is to remove Hamas's ability to steal the aid and to use the aid as leverage to continue to control the population. And part of that is literally eating down the massive stockpiles of aid that were in Gaza, that everybody was ignoring, and that the reports of starvation in Gaza, which were untrue, simply ignored. And it placed a massive blockade on Gaza. Now, the IDF has come to the belief, and the Israeli analysts have come to the belief, and therefore we have to take it extremely seriously, and we have to assume the IDF can make mistakes on this, and if it does, people will starve, will actually starve, not pretend starve like a year ago when these reports came, but actually starve. And so that has to be a massive priority. And Donald Trump said it, and Marco Rubio said it, and the Israeli army has now said it. And so there has to be a huge aid influx into Gaza. And the Americans have put together this mechanism that a lot of the aid organizations are unwilling to work with, but it bypasses Hamas as its core idea. Now, Hamas is willing, just like the Houthis, were willing in Yemen. 6 years ago, 250,000 people starved to death in Yemen. Okay, we're talking about a kind of ideological world. The Houthis are Shia, Hamas are Sunni. They're very different, but on these core points, strategic points, they're the same. Hamas are willing to have Gaza starve to death. The Israelis absolutely can't afford it, not morally, but also not strategically. And so there has to now be a massive influx of aid, and the mechanism to bypass Hamas has to be in place. Up to and including the point, and this was actually debated in the Israeli cabinet, of having Israeli soldiers actually distribute the aid, which is a very dangerous thing for Israeli soldiers to do because it's a lot of friction with a population that is still very much penetrated with Hamas fighters and gunmen who are on civilian clothes. So there is going to be hunger. There is hunger, and there's going to be starvation, and that has to be ramped up very quickly and fixed now.
I think people can't really see where this ends, especially given those two things being true. Do you see this as a forever war, or is there a viable off-ramp? And if so, what is that?
He already answered them.
The fundamental, I think, for what it's worth, an Israeli Jew who's now going to say something about Islam. Apologies to Muslims.
Trigger warning, listeners.
Yeah, I hope but also just in all honesty, I hope you recognize something of your world in what I say, because otherwise I just told you about what I think, my world rather than about Islam. There is within Sunni Arab Islam a serious, almost a culture war, a religious war, a theological divide, a kind of debate about the future and character of Islam.
Where? Where's that discussion?
Hamas was established in 1987 in Gaza as a branch in Gaza of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, which is this organization that believes that that the weakness of Islam in the modern age, the problems that the Arab world is having, you can overcome them by a return to the original Islam of the first generations of Islam and the holy generations, and a kind of return to the forefathers and the original piety of Islam. You shed all the nation states of the modern institutions and all the modernism, and then we will regain our geopolitical preeminence and scientific preeminence and commercial and all of that stuff. That's this fundamental sort of idea at the heart of the Muslim Brotherhood that Hamas is an outgrowth of. Now, it's complex. Hamas also separated from them. It's a big, complicated world. But Hamas's ideological heredity, so to speak, comes from the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. The founder of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt is a guy named Hassan al-Banna, who was a student of a reformist theologian in the early 20th century in Cairo, operating in Cairo, writing this incredibly important journal in Cairo called Al-Manar, named Rashid Rida. And Rashid Rida was the student of a guy named Muhammad Abduh, Abduh. I'm saying that so people can go to ChatGPT and look it up. Because if you trace that ideological lineage of this very radical, very violent, very burn the world to the ground to redeem Islam, ideological world of Hamas, you discover that Muhammad Abduh, the great grandfather of Hamas, religiously, was a democratizer and a man who wanted Islam, who wanted to find democratic institutions within Islamic law, and a man who wanted to modernize the Arab Muslim world. and catch up to the West by understanding that there's fantastic things to learn from the West.
Yeah.
And a man who, if you met him today and talked to him today, you would say, you're the solution to everything. And his ideological great-grandchildren are Hamas and also Al-Qaeda. And so through a slightly different branch, Said Qutb, the point, people really truly can look this up. This is all extremely accessible.
Okay.
The conservative Islam that searches for a solution to the modernism crisis in Islam, that has produced these terrible, violent, self-destructive, what ISIS is the destroyer of its own polity. Hezbollah is the destroyer of Lebanon. The Houthis are the destroyers of Yemen. There is nothing that this version of Islam has touched that it hasn't destroyed, except Israel, which it keeps trying to and failing. But the grandparents, the theological and ideological grandparents of these people, wanted exactly the opposite. And so there is a choice to be made
Doesn't make sense.
within authentic, real Islam for a completely different direction. And the Saudis had a huge theological tradition to draw on when they made this pivot after 9/11, basically, and began a de-radicalization of the Wahhabism of Saudi Islam. And the Emiratis, when they talk about peace and love, and they took Donald Trump to visit a synagogue they built in Abu Dhabi, that's authentic internal to Islam. And so there is this serious, profound debate. There is I'm gonna say something ridiculous, and I apologize for saying it. My only excuse is that I think that in some ways, to some extent, there is truth in it. The defeat of Hamas is a massive blow to the self-destructive elements of this branch of Islam. And there are unbelievably constructive elements in Islam. The single most conservative Muslim Brotherhood descended political party in the Palestinian world, which is the Ram political party among Israeli Arabs, is born from the same Muslim Brotherhood and recognizes the Jewish state and wants pacifism and for everybody to live in peace. So, then they're cousins of Hamas ideologically and theologically. So Islam has to make a choice. That's where this ends. Israel's only contribution to that, because I can't tell Muslims what to do and what to think and what Islam is to actually destroy Hamas.
Without getting too in the weeds, I wonder how that breakdown happened and how you get closer to the ideological grandfather as opposed to what we're seeing right now.
Part of it's incredibly complex. And I'm a student, right? You didn't come to me because I have 3 PhDs on this question. So I apologize ahead of time. This is where people should be going to read about. But basically, Abduh wanted this reformism, this modernization, this liberalization, this democratization. Excuse me, but he wanted to find it deep within the heart of Islam itself.
And then he didn't?
He and his student Rashid Rida went looking for it, and they found, for example, all kinds of consultative shura is the word in Arabic, consultative bodies around a ruler that can be turned into a serious feedback, not quite in a liberal universal democracy in the most liberal Western sense, but something quite democratic, quite open, quite Republican. And that was kind of the direction. But the impulse of finding within Islam the answers to the crisis of modernity, the crisis of weakness, which is not hypothetical and theoretical and theological. The European empires were slicing and dicing the Middle East and controlling them and subduing Arab and Arab attempts at independence and Arab aspirations. And so that crisis of weakness and modernity, what ended up happening is that these thinkers, as the generations went by, sort of jettisoned the modernizing, liberalizing parts and just held on to the returning to authentic Islam. I say that in quotes, what they viewed as authentic Islam. And it became this radicalizing, puritanical thing that started as liberalizing and finding solutions in authentic Islam. Again, apologies, I'm an Israeli Jew saying this, but it's all still there. And it can be turned to, and there are a great many Muslims I know who know that and who choose that other path. And so this is, people should, this happened basically in the lifetime of Rashid Rida in his own thinking, where he begins in 1898, very much a reformer, liberalizer, democratizer, in quotes, and ends his life in 1935, I believe, a supporter of jihadi violence. And so there's a pivot, there's a specific pivot. And we have to pivot back 100 years later.
there are some very prominent, arguably more institutional foreign policy experts that want to revive a two-state solution. In fact, they don't really see a future without it. And I wonder how you respond and really how you see a world in which Israelis are comfortable with a scenario where Gaza is controlled by Palestinians, keeping in mind that some of the Gazans working in these southern kibbutzim were the one drawing maps and committed a modern day pogrom on October 7th.
There's a study produced about 5 months ago, something like that, by very good Palestinian pollsters and very good Israeli pollsters of the two populations. And it was a study asking them about the war. And it had some tragic conclusions. Roughly 90% of Israeli Jews believe that the Palestinians' fundamental impulse is the total elimination of the Jews. And roughly 90% of Palestinians think that the Jews' fundamental impulse is the total elimination of them. The
Perfect.
sides have managed to convince each other. Now, I happen to think there's more blame on one side than the other, but that really
Yes.
is not the point at all.
It is the
What
point.
tragedy is the sides have managed to convince each other that there is no peace and there is no living together in any way. And that's been Hamas's argument, right? The idea that Hamas is fighting against occupation doesn't ring true to Israelis for the simple reason that Hamas carried out massive waves of terrorism against the peace processes of the last 30 years, not against occupations. It doesn't want an end to this conflict within Israel that still exists. And it's willing to destroy Palestine on the altar of ensuring Israel's destruction. And so both sides believe the other side genuinely wants them gone.
Okay.
That's the case that not a two-state solution isn't a good idea, but a two-state solution isn't possible. Nobody knows how to get there. If there is a fundamental reorientation of Palestinian politics in a way that's visible to Israelis, in which Palestinians say to Israelis, there basically been two strategies of liberation in the 20th century. There was brutal, violent terrorism to kick out the colonialists, which worked on the British in Kenya and it worked on the French in Algeria. And that's what the Palestinians have basically been trying. The Palestinian National Movement has basically been trying for many, many decades. And then there was Gandhi and King and the idea that I'm not threatening you. And by not threatening you, I cause a moral crisis within your politics, because what justifies military rule in the West Bank if there's literally zero threat? Palestinians, if they adopted that strategy, the path to that strategy is not something I have any way of even imagining. But a Palestinian political world that pivots from the one thing that has failed them to the thing that succeeded elsewhere, and an Israeli political pivot that says, look, it's all true and right, but we still militarily rule another people in the West Bank, and that is not permanent. That is not a thing, that is not the end of this story. And if we want to end this story, that has to end. That's a political world that makes sense. I have no idea if two states is possible. I truly don't know. I have never heard anyone explain to me a better solution. I please do. In other words, please find me, right? But there aren't still out there. So that's it. I just came out on the internet as a lefty. I just don't.
On a free press live stream.
On a free press, I just don't. I truly don't know. I don't believe in those categories. I believe in solutions and answers. Hopefully that comment sparks a debate, and I hear fun, interesting things.
Yeah, one listener, really smart question, asks if Zionism is reconcilable with a two-state solution.
Oh yeah, obviously, yeah. Zionism, as I understand it, is the last living Jews of the Eastern Hemisphere. I mean, all the rest are dead, with apologies to French Jews, who are the second biggest Jewish community in the Eastern Hemisphere, but they're almost all North African Jews, because after the Holocaust, all the Jews fled North Africa. So they're very much evidence of the same basic story. The Jews could survive nowhere in the nationalisms and the imperial collapses and all the massive turbulence of the 20th century, which produced so many genocides, but also a very big Jewish genocide. Zionism is the idea that Jews have to be safe. If a two-state solution is safe, I would even say more than that. If a two-state solution is safe, I think there's still an Israeli majority for separation.
Let's talk more Gaza.
Okay.
Israel's finance minister said, "We are finally ready to occupy the Gaza Strip." That's a quote. And as many will recall, in February, President Trump said that suggested the Palestinians leave Gaza and that the U.S. would take over the Gaza Strip. Now, I'm sure you saw these AI automated images on Twitter with, water slide. Yeah, with
Yeah.
water slides and pools on the Gaza Strip and Trump hotels. What does this kind of language signal to the Israeli government?
I have no idea. I truly don't understand this discourse. Gaza needs to be rebuilt. The Israeli finance minister, when he says occupation, he actually didn't. He said the word in Hebrew that means occupation, and it's a correct translation. But it also means conquest.
Mhm.
And he is the sort of right-wing side of the settlement movement that wants to build settlements in Gaza again. So when he says it, and he does, but most of the rest of 90% of Israel, we have pretty good polling on this. Huge numbers of Israelis. I had one poll early on in the war that's 90% are opposed to the idea of Israeli return to Gaza. But he's very eager for it. So, there's all this talk by all these people, and I have no idea what it means. The Americans right now are working on a serious proposal in which Gaza remains Gazan, Arab investment comes in, Hamas is gone, demilitarized, and all the leadership exiled, and someone else runs Gaza. And if that is what the Americans are working on with the Saudis and the Emiratis, Mara Gaza was just a PR stunt.
Can you walk us through?
Presidential meme.
Yeah. Can you walk us through Trump's grand strategy in the region? I don't even know if he can.
Yeah, no, I honestly, I don't think it's a strategy so much as a sensibility, and that's not a criticism at all. I think that what Trump is actually coming from, and I come from a country with universal health care, and therefore a very good healthcare system, and also therefore much higher life expectancy than the average American. So in some ways, I'm very much on the left-wing criticism of some of the, and I have no comment on Doge. I don't know anything. In other words, I want to praise Trump is what I'm saying. And that's going to get a lot of blowback. So I'm cool with that. Give me all the blowback. But I'm just saying, I'm only talking about this narrow topic. It's humility. Trump's policy in the Middle East is humility. I know. It's weird for me, too, to say that. But the basic policy is we don't know what the hell's going on in the Middle East. We don't understand. Qatar is in many ways an ally of Iran, and in many ways a fundamental theological enemy, and in many ways a Hamas, and also in many ways like a big investor in Harvard. In many ways, it's pro-Saudi, and what the hell is Qatar? I don't know. He comes to the Middle East and he says, "What can you give me?"
Mhm.
That's it. We're done. And he said that in his speech. We're done building. We're done explaining to you what democracy is. We're done. We're done. We're done with the moralizing. We're done with these ideas that we can somehow understand you. We don't understand you. By the way, maybe you don't understand that. Whatever. Come, America's for sale. Come buy. Not in a bad way. That airplane is potentially like.
We'll get there. Yeah.
But in a good way. In other words, come invest in the American microchip industry, $100 million or whatever. Right? Just what can you do for me? Now the Saudis have understood this to mean we will back you, this country with massive oil wealth, trillions of dollars in oil wealth, a military that is incredibly expensive, but almost zero capacity to actually fight a war. That's what we saw in Yemen. The Saudis are actually incredibly weak and vulnerable. And they have enemies in Iran, and they have enemies throughout the region. And there's this ideological war with the other half of Sunni Islam represented by the Qataris. But what if just putting $1 trillion into America within Trump's term is enough to make America willing to defend the Saudi Arabia? Not for sentimental reasons like the Democrats keep talking about, like values, which, by the way, they'll never actually defend you, because the same Democrats who talk about defending their allies with that won't actually come in to fight for you if Iran invades or attacks you. But if there's $1 trillion on the line in the American economy and Iran hits Saudi Arabia, Trump will go to war for $1 trillion invested in American factories. So that's what the Saudis are buying. They're buying America's alliance. And that's what the Qataris and the Emiratis, every American in that sense is for sale. And that's that humility of saying, no, we're going super basic. Just tell me what you get. Has reaped wondrous things for the American economy. If a tenth of it comes true, it's an extraordinary achievement.
We'll talk more about Qatar, but I want to get to Trump's evolution. In Trump 1.0, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He ushered in the Abraham Accords. And in Trump 2.0, we see something a little bit different. We see direct talks with Hamas, through Qatar. We're floating deals with Iran. There's an agreement with the Houthis. How much daylight do you see between these two terms and its approach to the Middle East?
I think Trump came into power in his second term with a whole lot of ideas that he wanted to implement. In other words, he had 4 years to sit, a little bit to stew, and very much to plan. And he feels the clock ticking. And so he came in, with a ton of things that he wants to do very fast. I think America should be ready, just based on me watching him on foreign policy questions that I slightly understand, not on American domestic issues that I don't understand. I think America should be ready for this pace of action, of policy, to not stop. In other words, he has a very clear sense of what he wants to accomplish. And the Israelis, I think the first term reflects his genuine sense of affinity with Israeli society. It fits his sensibilities. It's kind of a conservative society. I mean, left-wing Israelis they're quite liberal. They can be quite progressive, but they still have more children, secular left-wing Israelis, than any developed people in the world, right? So there's still a kind of pretty Middle Eastern, actually, society. That kind of jives with Trump's sense of the world. So, like, he likes Bibi and he likes Israelis. And there's a family connection there and all that. So, that's still true. The difference, I think, is that he's come to the conclusion that the Israeli government, on the fundamental things he wants, which is ending wars, striking big agreements, rebuilding things in America's interests, the Israelis are not competent at this point. He really, I believe, doesn't think Bibi is competent. Today, he said, I don't know if he knows how to get the hostages out or if he can get the hostages out. That's a damning thing for the American president to say out loud. That's a huge problem. And the Israelis have to start showing. And Netanyahu developed this way of ruling without saying anything ever to anyone. That needs to end. He has to be clear. He has to be honest. This is an administration that is honest. Even when it lies, it's honest in the sense that your kids talk to you, and when your kids lie to you, they're still honest because they're reflecting what they want you to know they want or they believe, right? So there's an honesty to the Trump administration in the sense that it does whatever the hell it wants. Netanyahu needs to approach with that honesty. What does Israel want? What's the end game? What's the end goal? If the far right of his coalition doesn't like it, he still needs to be able to say it out loud. And this kind of dancing between the raindrops and never ending anything and never explaining to people where anything is going, in Gaza but also elsewhere. Netanyahu's been fighting the Iranian nuclear program for 15 years. How's that gone for him? He has to actually have solutions on the table that everyone understands. And then I think he can pull Trump back to his side. But if without that, I think Trump's kind of written him off.
Yeah. Like we kind of alluded to before, Trump loves a deal. Loves it. I wonder if you kind of worry about that side of him leading to, let's call it, unsavory concessions.
I mean, I don't worry about it. There's definitely going to be unsavory concessions. I mean, he's making deals with Qatar and praised Qatar to the moon. Qatar funds some of the worst jihadi, vicious, anti-democratic, anti-American, tyrannical, jihadi, militant, burn everything to the ground organizations on earth. And I'm not even talking about Hamas. So Qatar is very much ideologically not a supporter of America, but it is a small country with vast wealth that uses that vast wealth to leverage relationships, to survive and to thrive and to advance its theology. Its theology is the wrong kind of it's the Islam we desperately don't need in this world that's going to burn down more Muslim societies and countries. So I wish that Trump held the line on that, but he doesn't. He wants just to do deals and he doesn't care about that kind of stuff.
Right.
Look, every time the Qataris think they have leverage on America, that's also leverage on Qatar. There's a base that the Qataris funded in the Al Udeid base, the single biggest overseas base, is in Qatar. Also, the threat of, and that's Qatari leverage over America. Also, the threat of moving it is massive American leverage. So the leverage works both ways if the Americans know how to use it. I think he can keep Qatar playing the American game and not too much funding America's enemies if he understands that.
Let's talk about Trump's Middle East tour. He visited Saudi Arabia, he visited Qatar, he visited United Arab Emirates, but notably he did not stop in Israel. How do you explain that choice?
I saw the Trump administration anonymous official leak to some press at some point, and it makes sense to me, so I tend to think it's correct and real, and that there's nothing to be gotten out of it. Everywhere he landed, he got hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. I think that somebody tallied up the total potential investment is, I forget the exact number, it's something like 1.8 trillion within his term. and 3.4 trillion in total, and people can just check those numbers, but it's a huge, right? The lands with the Emiratis, there's over $1 trillion in investment announced publicly and specific. What would you have gotten in Israel? A little song and dance, a little PR stunt, a little press statement with Bibi, but not a solution to Gaza, not a solution to hostages, not anything that he can actually take home. If there is, for example, Syrian-Israeli normalization, which is something the Syrian leader has been touting as part of his becoming closer to America, and also Durrani wants other levers of influence also to offset the Turks, who are kind of his patrons, but he doesn't want to live under their thumb. If that's something in the cards, I'm sure he'll come for the ceremony in Jerusalem or something like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But makes sense to me he wouldn't come. He has nothing to gain.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the more newsworthy moments from the tour. There were many. On Monday in Saudi Arabia, he said, enemies get you motivated, speaking in particular about Iran, and stated they will never have a nuclear weapon.
Nice.
But just a few weeks ago, you'll remember he floated a new Iran deal, essentially, which left many Americans, and I'm sure many Israelis, really confused by. What do you make of that?
It all depends what's in the deal.
Mm-hmm.
It all depends what's in the deal. Netanyahu had a very good answer to that. He gave a public speech in which he said, people should look at his speech, but I'll depart from his speech because I think there's a better way to say it, although he said it well. Bill Clinton had this amazing nuclear deal with North Korea. Amazing. Perfect. All the diplomats thought it was the best. And North Korea agreed it would never build a nuke. And because all the infrastructure was still left intact and all the uranium was still there, they just went and built nukes.
Mm-hmm.
So the deal was meaningless. And all of the grand poobahs of foreign policy at the State Department, a lot of them, by the way, would go on to negotiate the JCPOA, Obama's JCPOA, with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
It's a massive failure. You cannot have a nuclear deal in which the basic infrastructure remains.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a deal to remove Libya's nuclear program, in which all the infrastructure was removed.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a deal, in air quotes, where Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert bombed the Syrian nuclear reactor and destroyed the Syrian nuclear program, which was a North Korean program building for Assad a nuke. You have to remove the infrastructure. You can do it by bombing, you can do it by a negotiation. Here's the thing. Iran will never agree, ever, 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 to remove the infrastructure. And that infrastructure has no purpose other than a military nuke. It is a nuclear program far, far too small for electricity production. It's not energy nuclear program. Also, they don't need massive enrichment capabilities for energy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's far too big if it's like a research reactor. Like all the reasons you might have a nuclear program that aren't military, this is not that. This is a military nuclear program to produce a nuke. And if the infrastructure remains intact, we're in 2025.
Absolutely.
The most fundamental restrictions that Obama's plan would have placed on Iran, if Trump hadn't left it, would have sunset now. In other words, uranium enrichment would not be resuming legally under the JCPOA in Iran. So you can't have a 10-year leave all the infrastructure in place deal. If Trump's talking about a deal where the infrastructure is removed that Iran could never agree to, great. If his deal is anything less, it simply won't work, and you have to prepare for a Saudi bomb and a Turkish bomb because there'll be an Iranian bomb.
When he was in Qatar, Trump said he's never had a stronger relationship with Qatar as this, and we are, quotes, we're going to protect you. He also encouraged, as you noted, investment from Qatar in the United States, and the Qatar royal family has ties